Welcome to the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council with hosts Grace Evans and Moses Bratrud. Stay informed on the top stories on life, family, and religious freedom. Get the facts, stand for truth.
Hello and welcome to the Family Beacon podcast. This is an extremely special episode because I'm joined today by Melissa Ohden. We're so happy to have Melissa here. Melissa is an incredible woman. You've been touring the country for many years talking about your experience. And the story you have to share is, I think, incredible. And we'll get to that in a second. But we're just so excited to have you here in Minnesota, where we need to hear this story so much. And I'm just gonna give you the floor because you have an incredible story. At the very beginning of your life, there was a procedure that was started that was supposed to end your life, but you survived. What happened?
Yeah, this is relevant to Minnesota. This is relevant to the United States. This is relevant to the world. So yeah, the reality is that babies survive abortions. Babies survived abortions before Roe versus Wade. I can tell you many more of us survived during Roe than most people, even in the pro-life movement, recognized. And I can honestly tell you that babies are surviving abortions now post-Roe and post-Dobbs yet today. So I am one of likely tens of thousands of abortion survivors. But you wouldn't know that because of mainstream culture and Roe versus Wade and how that impacted our culture and families and impacted people like me and whether we felt like we were safe to share our stories. And then we add in family secrets and all of those kind of things. So my story is, I think, what most people think of when they think of the term abortion survivor. People kind of picture in their head a baby being born alive in the final step of an abortion procedure. And yes, that is one particular type of abortion survivor. I am the survivor of a failed saline infusion abortion. But we have folks who survived stopped abortion procedures that maybe were stopped at 20 weeks and they were later born at 30 weeks. We have abortion survivors who survived successful reversals of chemical abortions. So we are not always who people think of. And that's what we're in the business of trying to do, is educate people so they can understand more about the humanity of every child, but understand who an abortion survivor really is and how this doesn't just affect one person, but an entire family. And so you're right. This is who I am. That's where my story began. 45 years ago, I'll say that. Doesn't feel like 45. But 45 years ago, my birth mother, like so many women, was facing an unplanned pregnancy with little to no support. And unfortunately, was actually coerced and forced to have the abortion attempt that was meant to end my life. The saline infusion was the most common procedure performed back in the 1970s. And it involved injecting a toxic salt solution. So they would remove part of the amniotic fluid and then they would insert this toxic salt solution. And the intent of it was to poison and scald the child to death. And so typically lasted about 3 days. The child would soak to their death in that toxic salt solution. And then the next step of the abortion procedure was for labor to be induced. And so we know through my medical records that I soaked in that toxic salt solution for even longer than the standards. I soaked in it for 5 days.
Oh my goodness.
Well, they just kept trying to induce my birth mother's labor. And on the 5th day, they succeeded and believed that I would be delivered as a successful abortion. We know what that is, a deceased child, but that is the day that I was accidentally born alive.
Wow. I can only imagine the shock in the doctor, your mother. I understand that you were able to meet your mother a few years ago, your birth mother. Did she describe that moment to you?
Every survivor's experience is very complicated, as you can imagine. There's not a cookie cutter, this is how this experience looks or works. In my circumstance, it's been a long and winding journey to my birth mother, and really a lot of the answers that have come from seeking her and knowing her. But I now know that when I was born alive that day, of course they were shocked. There's a reason why the abortion industry calls us the dreaded complication of abortion. Because when you come face to face with that living, breathing child whose life you just tried to end, you do dread. Because what are you going to do now? And I think people need to understand that when we look back at even Governor Ralph Northam's comments back in 2019 that horrified our nation of, if a baby is born alive, what are you going to do? Him as a doctor saying, well, you'd wrap them up and a conversation would ensue. And, rightfully so, the nation was saying, oh my goodness. But if they only knew how long this has been going on, that it's still happening today. And I know that not just because of my work experience, but because I now know from being connected with nurses who helped care for me. Mm-hmm. Babies like me who survived abortions at St. Luke's Hospital in Sioux City, Iowa, were placed in buckets of formaldehyde to be picked up later as medical waste.
Oh my goodness.
That's where I would have ended up, except a nurse rushed me off to the NICU after I was laid aside for a brief period of time. She was unwilling to follow my own grandmother's orders to leave me to die. My grandmother is the one who forced the abortion. She was a prominent nurse, was there, and demanded that the other nurses leave me to die. And I know that's heartbreaking for people, but it doesn't matter if it was my grandmother. It should matter no matter who that person is.
Right.
But that's why I'm alive today, because those nurses defied her orders, rushed me off to the NICU. And I'm one of the lucky ones to have somebody who put their job on the line that day. If I would have been born alive at a Planned Parenthood, listen, I know what Planned Parenthood in St. Paul has said to a mom who had an abortion fail.
What was that?
We'll break the baby's neck.
Oh my goodness. Man, you think you're ready to talk about this. I think I'm ready to talk about this, and then something like that comes out. The real brutality that is underneath all of this, behind all of this, really comes out. So we're talking about your first day of a life on land, and two miracles, if I'm counting correctly, at least, because you survived the abortion, this toxic solution, 5 days in that, and then when you came out, you were supposed to still be murdered, be put in a bucket of formaldehyde, and that didn't happen. So that's two miracles. And then what happened next?
So many miracles. I now know that those nurses prayed over me, that they didn't forget me. I unfortunately know now that when I was rushed off to the NICU, my grandmother followed the nurse there who had rushed me in and threatened them, right? That they should never tell her daughter, my birth mother, that the baby had survived.
Oh, wow.
And so they carried that secret throughout their lives. My birth mother did not know for over 30 years
oh my goodness.
that I had survived the abortion. And I can tell you she's not alone in that. And I want people to recognize as we share these stories about the amount of trauma my birth mother was going through. So the trauma of being forced to have an abortion that she didn't want, and the physical and mental trauma of going through that abortion for 5 days, they started to think she was going to lose her life. So she was in such a space of being so traumatized that there's no way she ever could have known what was happening around her. And how could you ever think, based on what our culture says about abortion, as a woman, I don't think she would ever go, hey, did my baby survive my abortion procedure?
Right.
But that's what happens to us now in the work that we do at the Abortion Survivors Network. We have women approach us saying, I just took both chemical abortion pills and I think I'm still pregnant. Tell me what I did. Is there hope for my baby? What's their life going to look like? Should I go ahead and have that other abortion that the doctor tells me that I need to have if this one doesn't work? This is the world that we live in right now.
That's shocking. I really think that most people watching or listening to this will not have heard that before, that an abortion sometimes doesn't work, and then that a second abortion would be required. I mean, that just goes against all of our ideas that it works, that it's final, that it takes the problem away. When, of course, even when it is successful, quote unquote, the mother might be left with health effects that go with her for the rest of her life. So you survived the NICU, and then I understand you were adopted. Tell us about that.
I thought growing up, I led a pretty normal life like most people. I'm Midwest born and raised, probably always will be. I grew up in a home knowing that I was so loved by my mom and dad. I knew growing up it was not easy for them. I was a special needs adoption because I had been born prematurely. The doctors thought I would have a lot of disabilities. My abortionist had written on my medical records, we now know, he wrote that I was about 18 to 20 weeks. But my medical records show in one little part, a neonatologist remarked I was probably more like 31 weeks. Okay. But think about that. For my mom and dad, they're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm adopting this baby who was born prematurely at, say, 20 weeks. What's their life going to be like? Right. And so my mom and dad knew about the abortion. And like most parents, had no idea how and when or why they would ever tell me my story. Right. So I simply knew I was adopted, like my older sister is also adopted from another family. And I can't imagine not knowing my whole story now.
Yeah. So how did they tell you?
Well, it was like most family secrets, it wasn't pretty. I cleaned the way that it came out. I was 14 when my older sister faced an unplanned pregnancy herself.
Oh, okay.
And when she was faced with the decision in her mind of what she was going to do about it, my parents told her about my survival because they wanted her to understand what kind of decision she was making. And so that's ultimately how I found out. My sister let it slip to me one night in the middle of an argument. She said, at least my biological parents wanted me. And I was thinking, are you crazy? We're both adoptees. Mm-hmm. And the look on her face, I will just never forget it that night. And I never imagined in the world that this is what the story was. I didn't know back then that abortions failed. I didn't know that babies could survive them. And so, that night I asked my mom to sit down and told her about the argument, expecting some sort of story about what happened in my life. And, no parent should ever have to tell their child what mine did that night. And to hear those words, Missy, your biological mother had an abortion during her pregnancy with you and you survived it. That is the weight of the world for a 14-year-old.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I can only imagine. And from that moment and from that weight, how it happened for you was that you realized a calling to find other women, other people, not just women, find other boys and girls, men and women who survived that horrific procedure and unite them, give them a voice. So how did that start?
That's a long journey as well. And I want that to be an encouragement to other people. Everybody has a story. Everybody has an experience that they know in their heart can be used for good. But I think we grapple with it and think, how can I ever get on the other side of my pain? And so this has not been a short journey for me. It went through, forgiving my biological parents for the first time before I even knew all of their story. It meant, coming face to face with even one survivor's story, Gianna Jessen, knowing, right, all those years ago that there was one other person like me. And there's something so empowering to go, wow, I'm not alone. Mm-hmm. And so that led me on this journey of healing myself and ended up getting a degree in clinical social work, right? All of those things at the time that you're doing it, in the back of your head, yeah, some of this might be about me, but really, of course, you're like, oh yeah, this is just what I'm supposed to do with my life. But in the midst of it, married, started having a family. So I have two daughters, 15 and 8. And at the same time was searching for my birth mom, wanted them to hear from me before I ever shared my story, knew because of my faith that I felt like God was calling me to do something with it. But it was about 10 years of searching before I found my medical records, found my biological parents, and started to share my story publicly. So that was back in 2007. Okay. And you're right. Once I started to share my story, then I would start to hear the whispers of other people. Everywhere I would go to speak at an event for a pregnancy center or do an educational event with a Right to Life organization, somebody would call or send me an email and say, oh my gosh, me too. Which for me, right, that's part of my question to our culture is, why do we support the concept that all victims need to be supported, but yet there is a very particular population of victims that have never been seen and heard and acknowledged.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And that's, again, really why the Abortion Survivors Network was formed, because as I looked around our culture and I looked around the pro-life movement, I was thinking, there's no one. When I started to share my story, the answer to me was, are you sure?
Right. Of course.
Like, we need to do a background check on you.
Mm-hmm.
Because we don't believe, we haven't seen them. We don't acknowledge how often it happens. We don't track the statistics to know how often it happens or what the long-term outcomes are like. Who do we expect to see walk in the door? This is not what most people think an abortion survivor looks like.
Right. Right.
But I can tell you, this is what we look like. We are here walking among you.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really why we were formed, is to heal survivors. So we have a healing curriculum that I wrote, of course, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now knowing that it was me all along. We have an online community. So we have survivors around the world
Wow.
who gather together and who are starting to be named in their areas to be involved globally and share their story as survivors. We serve families, so moms who are experiencing failed and stopped and reversed abortions. So, if there's a mom right now who took both abortion pills and finds out she's still pregnant, we are here for that mom too, to say, you're not alone. We have moms that you can get to know who are walking in your shoes. We have a social worker you can talk to who's actually from Minnesota as well. We have a big footprint in Minnesota.
Wonderful.
But for them to go through this process and not be alone. And so we also offer opportunities for folks to be trained on how to share their story and still stay emotionally healthy. We give them opportunities on how to share their story and make a difference and not do it alone.
Right.
Because unfortunately, this culture is not a safe place for people like me.
Right.
And I feel like this is part of my calling as well, is to change that cultural mindset so that survivors and families know they're not alone and they have a place to do the work together.
Absolutely. And let's talk about that, the culture, because it would be my thought that if someone, Melissa's real, you're sitting right here, you're a wife, you're a mother, you're a taxpayer, presumably, and that's what matters to the government. And so you exist in all these facets. You're a church member. You're a child of Christ. And yet there are many people who absolutely would have the reaction that you mentioned earlier, just like, are you sure? Like you survived an abortion. Okay, lady, I'm sure you've had that reaction. Mm-hmm. And yet I feel that if you were able to actually convince someone on the other side, have a sidewalk conversation, No, I survived an abortion. Here's the medical records. I honestly feel, how could that not change their perspective on this issue?
And it has. I love getting to run into, especially young people that I've met 10, 15 years ago. I ran into one at the March for Life this year, and she said, oh man, I used to be pro-choice. And years ago, I came across your story. I went to an event you were speaking at, and it changed me forever.
No way.
How could I not be pro-life when I encounter you? And so for me, this is such an encouragement, because yes, will there always be people who are supporting abortion because that's where they're at, right? There's cognitive dissonance in terms of accepting the reality of the humanity of the child and how it bumps up against their beliefs. But by and large, most people look at the life of a survivor and go, wow, if we know babies survive abortions, what should that lead us to think and do when it comes to abortion legislation?
Absolutely. And that brings up something really relevant, which is the way in which pro-abortion legislators in the last year since the Dobbs v. Jackson decision have just got into this ride or die mentality. It's not enough that abortion is legal. We need to subsidize it. We need to make sure it's legal through all 40 weeks. We need to allow nurses to perform abortions. We need to get rid of anything that says that you have to dispose of the child's body in a certain way. And I'm just talking about in Minnesota. And that's going on nationally. It's going on federally. And I know you've had the chance to talk to pro-abortion legislators through testimony and also pro-life legislators. what do you tell them? What is your pitch to a pro-abortion legislator?
I think the greatest question, and I've asked this before Congress multiple times, which is, as a woman who survived an abortion attempt on my life, I have the supposed right in their eyes to an abortion. However, without the right to first being born, I would never have any other opportunity to exercise any right. So how do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah.
And I can tell you, I have never met a member of Congress who went, "You're right. That totally makes sense that we are laying out those two things." No, you see the look on their face. And I've had members of Congress come up to me later and give me a look in their eye that says, "I get it." Mm-hmm. And we know that. People know the truth about the humanity of the preborn child. Absolutely. They just do. And I think it's so concerning and yet not surprising what we've seen post-Dobbs. It echoes what we saw during Roe, but yet it shows us just how important it is for all of us to stay the course. Mm-hmm. For folks who would say, "Oh, Roe was overturned, the work is done." No, let's look at Minnesota.
Yeah.
And let's realize that the landscape has shifted. It doesn't mean the landscape has gone away.
Right.
And, for me in particular, when I look at Minnesota, you guys put out your 2022 reports recently. Mm-hmm. In that, there were 19 failed abortions listed in your complications. Mm-hmm. For folks who don't read state reports the way that I do, what I can say is 19 failed abortions in Minnesota means 19 babies like me mm-hmm. who survived failed abortions. Why are we not talking about this?
Yeah.
Why are we not looking at that state report and saying, okay, so then what? What happened to those 19 babies when they survived the first attempt to abort them? Was mom supported? Was mom sent to the Abortion Survivors Network to know that there's long-term support for her, that there's hope, that she can bond with her baby? Or was mom simply told, "Listen, you need to have another chemical abortion. And if that chemical abortion fails, you need to have a follow-up surgical." Mm-hmm. What happened to those 19 babies? What happened to their moms? And I can tell you that 19, I would say, is an underreport.
That, for one reason why that could be the case is we have these organizations like Just the Pill and others who are sending abortion pills through the mail. So we have actually no idea how many, and those are not being reported. So we have no idea how many women are attempting that at home. Maybe they're 20 weeks pregnant. So it's incredibly unsafe. But they're doing that. Maybe the child dies. Maybe the child survives. It's just this veil of secrecy. And so that's part of what I love about your organization and your story is that you're just ripping off the Band-Aid. Let's look at this. As a culture, we are responsible mm-hmm. for what happens to the most vulnerable people. We are responsible for looking that in the face. And I just love that you're making people look at the thing that they don't want to look at, the sin that, I call it a sin, but it's a sin, it's a tragedy that underpins our whole cultural discourse around this. And I'm just so grateful that you're telling your story. I want to ask though, because people like me, we are downcast right now. We are looking at this is in Minnesota, but it's in New York, it's in our biggest state, California, it's in Michigan, it's in plenty of, kind of states that you would think are moderate, mm-hmm. and then, oops, they're not actually. What would you say to people in those states, in this state, who feel a sense of despair, a sense that maybe we can help individual women, but how can we really move the needle?
My first statement would be, every obstacle is an opportunity. Mm. And I mean that. This is not me being naive, pie in the sky. This is me having lived out a clinical background and worked in some of the hardest lives, and then also me working in the pro-life movement. So every obstacle is an opportunity. Mm-hmm. And I mean, for us in particular, I can say for the Abortion Survivors Network, when Dobbs hit and we saw a 40% increase in the number of survivors reaching out to us, wow. It's not like we stayed there and said, okay, cool, this is where we need to be. No, you are constantly looking at what's happening and going, oh my goodness, There's another mom reaching out to us. There's another mom. There's 70% of pregnancy centers saying women are coming through the doors trying to confirm whether the abortion worked. Those may seem like obstacles, but they're an opportunity to know where we need to be serving. So whatever obstacle people are seeing in their piece, look at it as an opportunity, right? How can I work on this right now? And then constantly reflect on it. We don't get to just arrive there and be done. So every obstacle is an opportunity. And I would also say what we're seeing right now makes absolute sense because of what abortion has done to our culture.
Absolutely.
And so I think I would be more concerned if there was no battle.
Sure.
Right? That it was done and we just kind of went, No, I would say, what's going on here? So I would say this is what I would expect after nearly 50 years of legalized abortion, completely changing our culture and upending legislation and all those things. So look at it as a normal response to what has happened. And then look at where each person is called to be. Not every survivor is called to share their story. Not every person is called to be involved in the political side of things, but every single person together doing their part is what makes a difference. And for me, I think the power is in grassroots. And that's not just because I'm a grassroots kind of person, but that's where I believe the change will happen that ultimately leads to the path of changes in legislation once again in the favor of life is those everyday conversations.
Absolutely.
Those letters to the editor, those, calling up your legislator here in Minnesota, letting them know where you stand, voting, we have to vote.
Absolutely.
So for me, that's where the hope lies.
And I do think that there is the long-term cultural trends in which younger people tend to be pro-life more than sometimes older people, in which 3D ultrasounds, in which the voices of survivors are being heard, that all those things put together, I think you're looking at not a short road, but a longer road in which we eventually do make abortion unthinkable. And I think that's my hope, that's my prayer, and I do wonder, I do think that people are going to be watching this, they're going to be listening to this, and they haven't heard from you before. How can people learn more about you, your organization, your work, your story?
Our website is abortionsurvivors.org. My personal website, that I'll be honest, I don't update as much as we do the work website, is Ohden, OHDEN.com. Folks can find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook at the Abortion Survivors Network. We're going to be launching a whole awareness campaign in September so that people know that babies survive abortion. So folks can subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on social media, be prepared for a lot of really amazing awareness things to be taking place. And this is how we create that lasting cultural change, is taking an awareness campaign like this and amplifying that. So that is one great way people can get involved to make a big difference here in Minnesota and in other places.
That's amazing. I absolutely am so grateful for your time, for your story, that these resources are available for if anybody watching, listening, if you know somebody who has survived an abortion, or, one thing that I've come into contact with a lot of women who have had abortions and are now finding their own network of healing. And so those people need help. They need you to come alongside them. And Melissa, you're doing that work. And so I just want to say thank you so much for being here today, and may God bless your ministry.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to or watching this episode of the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you're up to date on life, family, and religious freedom. You can follow us on Instagram at MN Family Council and subscribe to us on YouTube to watch our content. Get the facts, stand for truth.